Welcome, patrons. Remember early in the year when I had a no spoilers video on Arlathan and promised to make one with spoilers soon? This is that video. While the last video covered what Thedas had believed about the Great Elven Empire, this video is going to focus more on what we have learned about the ancient elves through different media. So prepare for a lot of, strange, magical blue blah as we talk about the greatest empire Thedas has known, Elvhenan. History. Obviously, the Empire started somewhere, but we have no hard facts on the beginnings of this Elven Empire. There are a few things that fans like to assume as hints towards the Proto-Elven culture. I've seen fans say that the Dalish story about Elvhenan overthrowing his father, the sun, to assume that there was another leader who was overthrown at some point. Mythal was also called First of My People by Solus, and while there could be some overlap with the Dalish First, who are mages who are to become the keepers of the clan, as the word in the subtitles is not capitalized, I think he means this literally, and that Mythal is one of the very first elves. It could be that there was no real elven culture before Elvhenan. Currently, the best guess as to where the elves came from is actually Cole. Many assume that the elves were once spirits that learned to take on a physical form, or perhaps possessed an animal to gain a physical form.
Perhaps I am a dragon.
And I say many assume, but there is actually a lot of content that basically tells you this, to the fact that I personally consider this a fact, but it's not like it was ever stated outright, so maybe they could do something else with it, but I honestly think this is true. There's even a codex entry that mentions spirits as brethren of the air, so spirits were once considered people, kind of, to the Empire in some sense, and Solus himself thinks of spirits as people. Solus also mentions that there was a war. The generals in this war became respected elders, kings, and then finally gods, the Evanuris. Now, we don't know who this war was against, but it did end up solidifying the Elven nation. But who did they fight? Again, we don't know. There are murals of these weird lizard men in elven areas, which many assume to be the scaled ones. The only information we have on the scaled ones are from the Dwarven perspective, so at this time, the mural is the only hint that the elves even knew who they were, if that is indeed them at all. It could just be monsters, I don't know. Could the elves have driven the scaled ones off the surface of Thedas, and then they attacked the dwarves? We assume that the dwarves won their war with the scaled ones too, as the Empire's still around, but there's just a lot of unknowns here. Another possibility, and one that I find more plausible, is that the elves fought the Titans. There is a record of the Evanuris at least killing one Titan. The dwarves do fear the sun, or perhaps Elvhenan, and in Trespasser there are some hints towards the elves being the reason the dwarves do not go to the surface, and that perhaps the elves sundered the dwarves from their Titan, which the elves don't even view the dwarves as people, they're just witless workers, they're basically ants. It would also make sense that the elves, which in theory are beings of the Thade, went to war with the dwarves, beings of the physical realm, to fight for which realm rules Thedas. Anyway, in the Elven calendar, it begins at 1FA, FA standing for the founding of Arlathan, and 1FA is the year Arlathan was founded. Now this happened in about -7,600 ancient in the Chantry calendar, so a little over 8,000 years before any of the games are set. Arlathan wasn't the only city in Elvhenan, but it was the largest and its capital and the only one that we know the name of. There are legends from the Dalish on what it looked like, but for the moment, I think the best way to capture what the Elvhenan looked like in its glory is to highlight a few passages from the Virdathar Codex entry, and yes, I'm going to cannibalize an old video, so I have to read all this aloud.
The pages of this book, Memory, show a solemn group of elves in an amphitheater of living wood, entire trees grown into seats and stairs for the listeners to recline on. Two other elves in a spirit of learning are speaking in turn on ways to bend the properties of the material world when casting spells. At the end, the spirit, with an air of a senior lecturer, floats forward and booms in a surprisingly deep voice. The unchanging world is delicate. Spells of power invite disaster and annihilation. The unchanging world is stubborn. The pull of the earth fiercely resists, making fire run like water or stone rise like mist. The unchanging world rings with its own harmony. Listen with fearless hearts, and great works will unfold. Pages of this book, Memory, describe an elf approaching a city of glass spires so deeply blue they ache. The city's outskirts are wrapped in lakes of mist, and figures stroll along the pearly glowing strips as if they walked on solid ground. Groves of trees woven into enormous parks shelter elves in quiet hollows, while other elves walk below a river churning along an invisible shoal in the air. The scene hums with quiet talk and contentment as the Memory Makers reaches the city gates already thrown open wide. The pages of this book, Memory, describe a heated argument between a group of well-dressed elves inside an elaborately arched pavilion on an island floating in a void. In the distance, haloed by a blizzard of light, thousands of elves are maintaining an elaborate magical ritual that pulls raw essence from the Fade, funneled into a sphere in the air. Through the lens of the sphere can be seen a world of indigo waterfalls and rust-red jungles, and a temple palace so frescoed and cleverly carved it is a masterpiece in itself. The well-dressed elves shouting grows so loud it can be heard over the magic. One leaps at another, howling and pulling at a knife burning with prismatic flame. Architects of the Grand Sonalium, a gift from Blessed Celeste to clever Genet as thanks for a great favor, in friendly debate over the color of the palace's roof trim.
The Elveners were all part of the same pantheon, and they did sometimes take action together in some things, like against the Dread Wolf. They did very often fight amongst themselves, sometimes to devastating effects. Mythal was praised for suggesting setting up a champion duel between Elvhenan and Falandin over just a disagreement. Eventually, Mythal was betrayed and killed by someone other than the Dread Wolf as Parabolas. Solus creates the Veil and unlocks the Way of the Gods, in part for vengeance probably, and in part so that they don't destroy the world, per his words, and then he just poofs away, likely because he used so much of his energy that he needed a little nap. It's around this time that humanity pops up in Thedas. They sort of just appear out of nowhere, and I'm not going to rant about humanity too much, but eventually they get their act together enough and they form the Deventer Imperium with the help of the Old Gods, who gave them hints on how to do magic really well. Now, who are the Old Gods and how do they fit into this? I have no idea, but they probably do somehow. No one actually knows. We don't know what the Old Gods are. They just are there. With their new powers, they went to war with the Elves, won, and so enslaved the entire population. In Tevinter lore, they claim that they sunk Arlathan into the ground, making sure it would never be seen again. In reality, with the Veil having gone up, part of Arlathan was likely torn in half, with half of the city chilling in its probably own bubble of reality somewhere in the Fade like the Vir Dithara. Now, a very common fan theory is that the Golden/Black City is that part of Arlathan, and then the other part of Arlathan was the one probably sunken down deep into wherever. Now, as time passes, we know that there was at least one temple of Mythal that stood against the passage of time, and so there might be other ancient elves in other cities out there. But for the most part, once the Veil came up, Elvhenan was destroyed and Tevinter sealed its fate. Geography. Elvhenan expanded the entire known area of Thedas and even more. In the novel The Masked Empire, Shales, who is an ancient demon, so he would definitely know that this is true, mentions that the Empire used to reach west of currently known Thedas, which also happens to be where the hero Ferelden is looking for the Cure of the Calling. Perhaps related, perhaps not. We really only know of one named city, the capital of Arlathan, and we assume that it originally lay somewhere within the Arlathan forest. Although, with the elves' ability to create pocket dimensions and little bubbles of reality, it's a bit hard to talk about geography when they could literally do anything. Honestly, it wouldn't be surprising if the elves made a colony on one of Thedas' moon, which is an actual fan theory. There are also cities devoted to just one of the Elveners, which is what the Temple of Mythal was. So, if Mythal had one city just dedicated to her, surely there were other cities like it. Politics. From what little Solus tells us, the leaders of the Empire were the Elveners. While history remembers them as gods, they didn't start as such, saying that they were originally respected elders and generals and kings, finally being remembered as the Dalish creators. So from this, we can assume that at one point the Elven Empire was ruled by multiple monarchs. Now, Solus does mention having these crazy, I don't want to say parties, but the Orlesian Empire wasn't a surprise to him. So I think probably the Elveners and their empire looked kind of similar to the Grand Game. It's probably something along those lines. Now, we are unsure at this point if the lands were broken up so that each ruler had a different land that they ruled, or if they ruled together. But from the little we know, there was at least entire cities that were populated only by those who worshipped or were under one of the Elveners. Now, under the Elveners, there were Elven nobles, sort of. There is a question if Elven nobles were a myth, because we only have the Dalish legends and a story that Philoson tells Briala. If any of that isn't true, it's possible that in some way every citizen of Elvenan was a slave to one of the Elveners, which then brings us to that there were definitely a lot of slaves, and each belonging to a certain god. Now, slaves were marked with the Valisleen, to whatever god their master or whatever they belonged to. Honestly, it's a little bit vague. Here, we just know that slaves were a really big deal in Elvenan. Either way, all that we really know is that the Evanuris were the masters of this realm, and that Solus was both one and also not one, and he wanted to free the slaves because there was like a lot of, like, mostly slaves. There might have been a noble class. It might have even been the noble class eventually dissolved into more slaves. Keep in mind that there's almost like 7,000 years of history that's just gone, so a lot could have happened in that time period. Culture. Something to express here is that Thetis is just missing something that Elvhenan had. We aren't really sure what that means, as we've never been told, minus Solus saying it was like waking up in a world of tranquil and that it's horrific to break people from their connection to the Fade. But there seems to be like a depth to that we don't understand. The best way to explain this is by another Vira Dithara Codex entry that talks about two lovers making, love. They form bodies. Just for kissing, and they have magic so harmless and as easy as breathing. I almost want to say that life with the Veiled On was kind of like a dream, that anything could happen, and the highest pleasures and the deepest sorrows, and that the world of Thetis as we know it probably seems very dull and gray in comparison. Now, even that's just a guess, and maybe there's like some actual mechanics in play here that we just don't know and won't find out until later games, but a lot was lost when the veil came down, and we don't really know what that means yet. Religion. If there was a religion before the Evanuris, we do not know it. One assumes that there likely was, or at least like a belief system of sorts, but we have no hints as to what that could be. What little we have of the worship of the Evanuris revolve around prayers, statues, and a little bit of practice. This depends on the god, and I actually go over this more when talking about the single Evanuris in their own video, so I'm not going to waffle on here, but for the most part, it seems each god had their own way of worship and handling their corner of the empire, if they had one. I don't know, at least their city, I don't know how this worked. Mythal's followers seemed to have it the best, while others like Fountain and Endrul seemed like live quite a nightmare and were begging their gods not to die. So that's real fun. Dress. Elves and Thetis have a few interesting differences in their dress compared to the other races, including exposed toes, a smock-like thing that they would wear over, like, things, and a lot of green. But we aren't sure how much of that is Dalish and how much is left over from the Ancient Elves. The only true fashion anything from the Ancient Elves are the Sentinel armor, and, like, this one mural that is just, like, robes. The Sentinel armor is highly decorated and does have little toe shoes, so at the very least the elves seem to like their toe freedom a lot and being decorative, which does carry over to modern times. Food. So like, look at how much history we have on the Empire. We have almost nothing on food, with the closest thing being an almost joke codex entry about Brother Genitivi going to the Black Emporium and eating a pickled apple that is said to be Arlatham and is also amazing. But, and here's the kicker, there is actually a decent theory that the elves may not have needed much food, if any at all. Now, Euthanaria, the practice of going to a sleep for eternity and wandering the Fade, had an ultimate ending of sorts where the sleeper would be able to draw substance from the Fade and not need any food or water or whatever. Before then, the sleeper would be given a drink in their sleep that was brewed from herbs. This is also kind of like the in-lore theory for why Solus isn't like tea. Fun facts. Now, some have suggested that those who achieved this status and then woke back up wouldn't need to eat. So Solus, and perhaps other Evanuris and powerful elves, didn't need food, much like spirits and whatever you call coal. Now, Solus does eat an Inquisition, so you can either say that he was just eating to eat, to like pretend to be mortal, or that with the veil up he actually needs to eat. I'm not quite sure. For some reason in the World of Thetis books, they make a point to say that Solus didn't eat a lot. I don't know. I don't know why they would say that unless it was important. But anyway, that's the theory. Relationship with other races. Humans. For human records, he only came to Thetis after the veil went up, and for all I know, the veil was always up. It was a shock to them that the veil was man-made. So Dalish cite the humans as the reason for the elves becoming mortal, and it's unknown if elves at the time actually believed this or not. The elves call humans shemlins, or quick children, because their lives were so short. The Dalish believe that the ancient elves caught mortality like a disease, and so hate the humans for it. And if nothing else, Tevinter later conquered the remains of the Elven Empire and enslaved the entire race, so the Elven Empire didn't get along with the humans too well when they were there. But it was really only the tail end of it, at least in our current understanding. The Dwarves. I sort of already went into this, I'll sum it up here. The dwarves and the elves didn't really get along. The Durgenlin, as they call them, seemed to be less than people in their eyes. What's interesting to the dwarves, however, is that I'm not sure if the Wall of Memories in Orzammar goes so far back to the time of the elves and whatever happened between them. If it does, we have not been told as such. Now, when Arlathan was falling, the dwarves did side with the Deventer Imperium and even killed one of their own taigs for housing elven refugees. QUNARI. To our knowledge, the elves never met the QUNARI. However, there is a theory that the QUNARI are related to the elves somehow. Curpheus tells a QUNARI Inquisitor that they are an experiment gone wrong, so some believe that the QUNARI as a race are elves who were given a large amount of dragon's blood. Others like to rope in Gillenon, who like to experiment on people, saying that the QUNARI were a created race from the elves and were designed to be a part of like a warrior class system, and with many roping in early concept designs for the elven sentinels and Inquisition that had horns. All that being said, though, while there are like a ton of hints that something weird is going on with the QUNARI, at this point there isn't actually anything solid connecting Elvhenan to the QUNARI. And that, dear patrons, is all that we know on Elvhenan. I know a lot of it was I don't know, but that is frankly just where we are in the series right now. We don't really know much of Elvhenan. So, do you still have lingering questions, proof that I'm wrong, comments about your own fan theory? Feel free to tweet me at EchoLorthon on Twitter or send a PM to user Gillenon on Reddit. Daresh Sharal.